Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. On March 25th, 1911, nearly 500 workers, most of them young immigrant women, some as young as 14, were finishing their shift at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York City, a garment factory occupying the top 3 floors of a 10-story building. It was a Saturday afternoon close to quitting time. At around 4:40 p.m., a fire flared up in a scrap bin beneath a cutting table on the 8th floor, likely sparked by a discarded cigarette or a match igniting scraps of cotton fabric that had been piling up for months. Within minutes, the flames spread upward through the shafts and stairwells, feeding on paper patterns and fabric scraps scattered across every floor. Workers rushed for the exits. They found the doors locked. It was common practice at the factory to lock stairwell doors from the outside during working hours, a policy meant to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks, with only a single foreman holding the key. On the 9th floor, where most of the workers were trapped, one stairway was already consumed by flames, and the other, the one leading to Washington Place, would not open. The building's only fire escape, flimsy and never designed to handle a mass evacuation, buckled and collapsed under the weight of those trying to flee, sending several people plunging to their deaths. Elevators could only carry a handful of people per trip, and after a few desperate runs, they stopped working altogether. With every route blocked, some workers did the unthinkable. They leapt from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floor windows, choosing a fall over the flames. Firefighters arrived quickly, but their ladders reached only the 6th floor, 6 stories below where people were jumping, bodies falling onto the unfolded safety nets, and hoses burst straight through them. In less than half an hour, it was over. 146 workers were dead, mostly women, some barely more than children. The factory owners tried for manslaughter, were acquitted. In the aftermath, tens of thousands marched through the streets of New York in protest. The tragedy directly led to sweeping reforms. Mandatory fire drills unlocked exits during working hours, sprinkler requirements, and the creation of the organization that would eventually become the modern OSHA, the agency still responsible for workplace safety in the United States today. Bhopal Gas Tragedy. On the night of December 2nd into 3rd, 1984, a pesticide plant on the outskirts of Bhopal, India, operated by Union Carbide, held 3 massive tanks of methyl isocyanate, or MAC, an extremely toxic chemical used in producing insecticides. The plant had been losing money for years. Safety staff had been cut in half. Refrigeration units meant to keep the volatile chemical stable had been switched off to save on costs, a decision made months earlier and never reversed. That night, water somehow entered Tank 6-1, triggering a runaway chemical reaction that none of the plant's remaining safety systems were equipped to contain. Pressure inside the tank climbed rapidly. A safety valve gave way. Roughly 40 tons of methyl isocyanate gas began pouring out into the night air over a city of more than 800,000 people, most of them asleep. There was no warning siren, no evacuation plan, no information given to the surrounding neighborhoods about what chemicals were even stored at the plant, let alone what to do if they escaped. Residents woke up choking their eyes, burning their lungs, filling with a substance many had never heard of. Panic spread faster than any official warning could. People ran through the streets in the dark, coughing, collapsing, trampling one another. In the confusion, many dying right where they fell. By morning, the streets around the plant were littered with bodies, human and animal alike. The official immediate death toll was recorded at 2,259, but independent estimates suggest the true number who died within the first 2 weeks was closer to 8,000, with thousands more dying in the years that followed from long-term exposure. More than 500,000 people were affected in total, many left with permanent lung damage, blindness, and birth defects passed down to their children. It remains to this day the worst industrial disaster in human history. Union Carbide eventually paid $470 million in compensation, a fraction of what victims' advocates argued was owed. The disaster reshaped chemical safety regulation worldwide, leading to community right-to-know laws that require companies to disclose exactly what hazardous materials are stored near residential areas. Hamlet, chicken plant fire. On September 3rd, 1991, the morning after Labor Day weekend, roughly 90 workers clocked in at the Imperial Food Products chicken processing plant in the small town of Hamlet, North Carolina. The plant had operated for 11 years without a single safety inspection, having never registered with the state labor department as required by law, a loophole nobody had ever bothered to close. That morning, a hastily improvised repair to a hydraulic line near the deep fryers failed. Pressurized hydraulic fluid sprayed directly onto the plant's gas-fired fryers, igniting almost instantly into a massive grease fire that spread through the building far faster than anyone could react. Thick black smoke filled the processing floor within moments. Workers, many of them women earning barely above minimum wage, ran for the nearest exits and found them locked. Plant management had ordered several exterior doors, including a clearly marked fire exit. Sealed shut months earlier, a decision workers were told was meant to keep flies out of the food processing area. In truth, according to later testimony, it was meant to stop employees from stealing chicken. There was no fire alarm. There was no working sprinkler system despite an earlier fire at the same plant, having been serious enough to require a new roof. There had never been an evacuation drill of any kind. Workers pounded on locked doors, some managing to kick them open, others collapsing in the smoke before they ever reached an exit at all. 25 people died that morning, and 54 more were injured, many with permanent burns, blindness, or lasting respiratory damage. It was 80 years, almost to the anniversary of the Triangle Fire, the same failure, playing out all over again in a different country, a different industry, an ocean, and a century apart. The plant's owner was eventually sentenced to nearly 20 years in prison, of which he served 4, after pleading guilty to 25 counts of involuntary manslaughter. The disaster prompted North Carolina to pass more than a dozen new workplace safety laws and fund dozens of new factory inspector positions almost overnight, a stark admission of how easily a tragedy like Triangle could still happen unless someone was actually checking. Kader Toy Factory Fire. On May 10th, 1993, at a sprawling toy factory complex outside Bangkok, Thailand, roughly 3,000 workers, mostly young women from rural villages, were producing stuffed animals and plastic dolls for major international toy brands. Around 4:00 p.m., a small fire broke out on the ground floor of Building 1. It seemed minor at first. Workers on the upper floors were told to keep working the fire, supposedly under control. It was not. The alarm system in that building didn't even sound. Flames spread rapidly through piles of synthetic stuffing and plastic materials, exactly the kind of highly flammable inventory the factory was built to produce. As smoke poured upward, workers on the crowded upper floors finally realized the danger and rushed for the exits, only to find the ground floor doors locked, chained shut by security guards under standing orders to prevent employees from stealing merchandise. The building's stairwells, undersized and packed with panicking workers, began to buckle under the uninsulated steel frame, which had never been designed to withstand real fire. As the structure weakened, entire stairwells collapsed, trapping hundreds above the flames with nowhere left to go. On the 4th floor alone, roughly 800 workers had been crammed into a space served by just 8 toilets and equally inadequate escape routes. With the ground floor cut off and the stairs failing beneath them, workers on the 3rd and 4th floors began jumping from the windows, just as they had at the Triangle factory more than 80 years earlier, and half a world away. By the time the fire was extinguished, 188 workers were dead, and more than 500 injured, many with permanent disabilities from their falls. It surpassed the Triangle Shirtwaist fire to become the deadliest factory fire in recorded history, a record that still stands today. Despite the scale of the tragedy, the disaster received little international media coverage at the time. The company eventually paid a one-time compensation of roughly $8,000 per victim's family, and was later fined the equivalent of about $12,000, a decade after the fire for building code violations. Imperial Sugar Refinery explosion. On February 7, 2008, at a sugar refinery in Port Wentworth, Georgia, workers were carrying out an ordinary evening shift, refining and packaging granulated sugar, as they had for more than 80 years at that same facility. What almost none of them knew was that fine sugar dust, an inevitable byproduct of the refining process, had been quietly accumulating for years in the enclosed spaces beneath the storage silos, piling up in places knee-deep, thick enough to leave visible drifts along beams and equipment. Sugar dust, like flour dust or coal dust, becomes explosive once it's suspended in the air in high enough concentration, a fact the company had reportedly been warned about since as far back as the 1960s. At approximately 7:15 p.m., an overheated bearing on an enclosed steel conveyor belt beneath the silos ignited a small pocket of that dust. The resulting blast, though initially contained, was strong enough to shake loose massive additional clouds of accumulated sugar dust throughout the packaging buildings. That airborne dust ignited an instant later in a second, far larger explosion, then a third, then a fourth, tearing through the plant in a chain reaction that no single spark could have caused on its own. The shock waves buckled 3-inch thick concrete floors, collapsed brick walls, and blocked stairwells that workers were desperately trying to use to escape. Fireballs rolled through the sheet packaging areas, engulfing workers in flames before they had any chance to react. 8 employees died at the scene. 6 more, horrifically burned, succumbed to their injuries over the following weeks at a specialized burn center. In total, 14 people lost their lives, and 36 more were injured, some with permanent life-altering conditions. Investigators later confirmed that company management had known about the dust hazard for decades and had simply never addressed it, treating years of visible ankle-deep dust as a housekeeping inconvenience rather than the explosive hazard it actually was. Workers who had raised concerns about the dust in years prior said they were told it was simply part of the job, an unavoidable byproduct of working in a sugar refinery, nothing to be alarmed about. The disaster reignited a long-stalled push for national combustible dust safety standards in American industry, a regulatory gap that remarkably still has not been fully closed. West Fertilizer Company explosion. On April 17, 2013, in the small town of West Texas, a fire broke out at a fertilizer storage and distribution facility that had been operating since 1962. The building held roughly 270 tons of ammonium nitrate, a common agricultural fertilizer that is normally stable, but becomes capable of detonating when exposed to intense heat, especially when stored, as it was here, in a simple wooden structure with no sprinkler system at all. Volunteer firefighters arrived quickly and began working to contain the blaze, entirely unaware of what was stacked just feet away from the flames. At 7:50 p.m., roughly 20 minutes after the fire was first reported, the ammonium nitrate detonated, not once, but twice, milliseconds apart, with a combined force equivalent to as much as 10 tons of TNT. The blast registered as a small earthquake and was felt for miles. It carved a crater 10 feet deep and nearly 100 feet wide, directly where the storage building had stood. More than 150 buildings in the surrounding town were damaged or completely destroyed, including a middle school, a high school, and a nursing home, all located well within what safety experts now consider a dangerously close blast radius. 15 people were killed. 12 of them were firefighters and emergency responders, men who had rushed toward the fire with no idea they were standing beside enough explosive material to level a city block. Over 260 more people were injured. Investigators later discovered the facility hadn't been properly inspected by federal regulators since 1985, nearly 30 years earlier, and that the company storing the ammonium nitrate had never disclosed the true size of its stockpile to Homeland Security officials, despite federal law requiring it. The Chemical Safety Board later concluded the disaster was entirely preventable, noting that ammonium nitrate explosions in storage have throughout history always had the exact same root cause, an uncontrolled fire reaching material that should never have been kept in a combustible wooden building in the first place. Similar warehouses, some holding even larger stockpiles, were later found scattered across the state, many sitting within a half-mile of schools, hospitals, and nursing homes protected by regulations that still years later remained largely unchanged. Rana Plaza collapse. On April 24, 2013, in Savar, near Dhaka, Bangladesh, thousands of garment workers arrived for their shift at Rana Plaza, an 8-story commercial building, housing 5 separate clothing factories that supplied major international fashion brands. The building had never been designed to hold factories at all. It was originally approved as a 4-story structure for shops and offices. The top floors, including the ones packed with heavy industrial sewing equipment and massive diesel generators had been added illegally without permits on land that engineers later determined was unsuitable for a structure of that size to begin with. The day before, large cracks had appeared in the building's walls, visible enough that a television news crew filmed them. Shops and a bank on the lower floors closed immediately, taking no chances. The garment factory owners on the upper floors did not. Workers were told the cracks were nothing to worry about, and that anyone who refused to report for their shift would lose an entire month's pay. Thousands of workers, unable to afford that loss, went back inside the following morning. When the building's massive backup generators kicked on that day, the structure's damaged support columns finally gave way completely. At 9 a.m., without warning, all 8 floors of Rana Plaza came down at once, collapsing into a single crushing mass of concrete, steel, and machinery, burying thousands of workers instantly beneath the rubble. The scale of the wreckage made rescue operations almost impossibly slow. Survivors were pulled from the debris for more than 2 weeks, some trapped for days beside the bodies of co-workers who hadn't made it, a few rescued only after having a crushed limb amputated on the spot to free them. The search for survivors and remains continued for 19 days. When it finally ended, the confirmed death toll stood at 1,134, with more than 2,500 additional people injured, making it the deadliest garment factory disaster and one of the deadliest structural collapses of any kind in modern history. In the aftermath, the building's owner was arrested, attempting to flee across the border. A total of 41 people, including the owner, were formally charged with murder for ordering workers back inside a building they knew was structurally unsound. More than 200 global fashion brands and retailers eventually signed a legally binding safety accord, funding independent inspections across thousands of factories throughout Bangladesh's garment industry, a reform effort that continues imperfectly to this day. Tianjin warehouse explosion. On the night of August 12, 2015, at the port of Tianjin in northern China, a logistics warehouse operated by a company called Ruihai International was storing a chaotic mix of hazardous chemicals, including hundreds of tons of ammonium, nitrate sodium cyanide, and drums of highly flammable nitrocellulose, packed together in quantities that far exceeded what its license actually permitted. Around 1050 POEM workers noticed smoke. A fire had broken out inside, later traced to a container of nitrocellulose that had dried out in the summer heat and ignited spontaneously. Firefighters arrived quickly and began doing exactly what firefighters are trained to do, spraying water on the flames. Nobody told them that water meeting certain chemicals stored just feet away would make things catastrophically worse. At 11:30 p.m., the fire reached the stockpiled ammonium nitrate and detonated a blast, measured at the equivalent of roughly 3 tons of TNT. Before rescue teams could even process what had happened, a second explosion tore through the site less than a minute later. This one equivalent to more than 20 tons of TNT, powerful enough to be picked up as a seismic event and photographed from the International Space Station, orbiting hundreds of kilometers overhead. The blast flattened the warehouse complex entirely, hurled shipping containers across the port like toys, and shattered windows in buildings more than a kilometer away. Of the 173 people ultimately confirmed, dead 104 were firefighters and police officers, the vast majority of them the very first responders who had rushed toward the warehouse with no idea what chemicals were actually inside it, because the company had never disclosed an accurate inventory to anyone. Nearly 800 more people were injured. In the crater left behind, investigators later found sodium cyanide contamination in the groundwater at concentrations hundreds of times above safe limits. The investigation ultimately found the warehouse had been operating with an expired safety license for 8 of the previous 10 months, and blamed dozens of company officials and government inspectors for negligence, bribery, and willful blindness to a stockpile that should never have been allowed anywhere near a populated port district in the first place. Looking at these disasters side by side, spanning more than a century and 4 different continents, the same pattern keeps resurfacing. A warning that was ignored, a cost-cutting shortcut that seemed small at the time, and workers who had no real power to refuse showing up anyway. Locked doors killed people in a New York sweatshop in 1911, in a Thai toy factory in 1993, and in a North Carolina chicken plant in 1990, 180 years apart, on opposite sides of the planet, for the exact same reason, because it is always cheaper to keep a door locked than to trust the people working behind it. An ignored safety warning turned methyl isocyanate into the worst mass casualty event in industrial history, and turned ordinary sugar dust into an inferno that killed 14 people who had no idea the air around them could explode. It's the reason regulators today talk less about any single chemical or machine and more about something harder to legislate directly: the gap between what a company knows is dangerous and what it's actually willing to fix before someone gets hurt. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for similar ones, and feel free to drop suggestions for the next video down in the comments below.